todos. Buenos días a todos y todas desde Copenhague y bienvenidos al webinar Introducción al financiamiento climático y arreglos institucionales, organizado por la alianza entre el Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente, PENUMA y DTU, que es la Universidad Tecnológica de Dinamarca. Este taller es el último de los llevados a cabo estos días bajo el marco del proyecto CAC Panamá, financiado por el NDC Partnership. Antes de todo, me gustaría agradecer por su apoyo estos últimos meses a la Dirección de Cambio Climático, a mi ambiente, a la Oficina Regional de ROLAC de UNEP. Mi nombre es Jorge Hinojosa y trabajo en el equipo de finanzas y modelos de negocio en proyectos de cambio climático y transparencia climática. Y el día de hoy voy a ser moderador del webinar. Un par de cosas antes de pasar al contenido principal de nuestro taller. Este taller de hoy va a durar 3 horas, incluyendo una pausa de 10 minutos y otra pausa antes de la actividad de grupos, como lo hicimos el día de ayer. En este sentido, les quería comentar que nos pueden enviar en cualquier momento en el chat general o directamente a mí sus preguntas, y al final de todas las presentaciones también vamos a estar contestando. Les comento también que este workshop ya ha comenzado a ser grabado. Todo va a estar grabado y después va a estar disponible en nuestra página después de unos días. Ahora quería hablar un poco sobre la agenda de hoy. Voy a pasar a presentar la agenda. Como vemos, hay 2 pausas y vamos a iniciar con las presentaciones de nuestros colegas Søren y Merete, y después nosotros vamos a pasar a la actividad de grupo al final, a dividirnos en 3 grupos como el día de ayer. Entonces, ahora voy a pasar a presentar a nuestros panelistas del día de hoy. Søren Lutken es nuestro primer panelista y él ha estado trabajando en proyectos de financiación del desarrollo desde 1996 en el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores danés. Ha estado con UNEP DTU desde el 2010 haciendo trabajos de financiamiento climático. También ha estado en proyectos del Mecanismo del Desarrollo Limpio y ha hecho un trabajo de inversión climática, de NAMAS, también muchas publicaciones como parte de las NAMAS, y también creó la NAMA Academy. También va a estar participando Merete Pedersen, que conocieron también ayer, que es la jefa de sección de negocios y finanzas aquí en el DTU, y ella está trabajando en muchos proyectos de fortalecimiento de capacidades y marcos institucionales, en algunos proyectos de ICAT, de CIVIT, también en varios proyectos de financiamiento verde con el Fondo Verde del Clima. Tiene experiencia en varios países, entre ellos en África, en Asia también. Entonces, estos son los panelistas del día de hoy. Y les recuerdo que vamos a tener la herramienta de interpretación disponible en su plataforma de Zoom. En la parte de abajo a la derecha van a poder encontrar la interpretación y escoger su idioma. Entonces, ahora voy a pasar la parte de una síntesis de lo que hablamos ayer. Me gustaría empezar hablando sobre la importancia de poder mapear el financiamiento y el apoyo climático, como hablábamos ayer. Como nos comentaba Merete, el tema de poder contar con una base de datos y herramientas de mapeo para países en desarrollo se ha convertido en primordial, y ahora con los reportes de transparencia de las NDCs, comunicaciones nacionales, va a tenerse que hacer más y más transparente y efectivo. Y como hablábamos, tenemos los marcadores de río y el CPR como herramientas. Estábamos viendo, por ejemplo, que los marcadores de río nos ayudan desde un punto de vista de la OCDE, de los países donantes y los miembros de la OCDE, cuáles son los proyectos, cómo van entrando a lo que se clasifica como financiamiento climático y las puntuaciones que se les van dando del 0 al 2. Por otra parte, el CPR es también diferente y nos ayuda a salir del enfoque marcadores de río para los que no son miembros de la OCDE o que tampoco están en la base de datos tan fácilmente. Y para políticas públicas nacionales climáticas, el CPR nos permite también tener una sintaxis y una división entre lo que es financiamiento climático, de mitigación, adaptación, y vimos unos ejemplos de proyectos de mitigación y adaptación, cómo se está catalogando los proyectos, o sea, cuando un proyecto es de inversión en infraestructura, cuando es de mitigación y de adaptación, cuando es transversal, cuál es la calificación que se le va a dar como parte de financiamiento climático eh, para poder tenerlo en la transparencia. Y también vimos ejemplos de otros países, como se hablaba de las Maldivas y de Chile, como es la importancia de tener una estructura robusta de financiamiento climático, una plataforma que te permita tener el acceso a la información actualizada y de toda la coordinación entre ministerios que permita tener simplemente todos los proyectos en una base de datos, porque si vimos en el proyecto de Maldivas, pues que hay muchos retos, que a veces los proyectos pues en un departamento se quedan en papel o que no llegan hasta el gobierno nacional o que simplemente no se informó que eran de financiamiento climático y no hubo pues una comunicación alineada entre las dos instituciones y este tipo de temáticas que es muy importante tener en mente como lección aprendida, ¿verdad? Porque si estamos hablando de un país ahora como hablábamos de Chile, que bueno, ya cuenta con el sistema de transparencia y que tiene el sector público, privado, de una forma eh, más avanzada, también tiene sus retos, ¿verdad? Porque el hecho de decir qué es la taxonomía de financiamiento climático para el sector privado es una cosa, pero después a la hora del reporte, pues hay bastantes temas interinstitucionales o de coordinación o que no se conforman con una sola plataforma y los datos van quedando por varios lugares, ¿verdad? Eh, También tuvimos la actividad de grupo, en la cual fue una discusión muy rica entre los participantes. A mí en lo personal me gustó cómo los mensajes también se fueron integrando y fuimos compartiendo ciertos retos que tiene Panamá hasta el momento, que varios países de la región también tienen. Y en el caso de contar con un sistema en el que mi ambiente, el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, estén en comunicación y que todos los proyectos de las bases de datos estén de una forma actualizados y que se tenga el entendimiento básico y principal de financiamiento climático en estos ministerios y los que van a estar haciendo el reporte y pues después llegar, ¿verdad?, a todo lo que decíamos de tener un sistema MRD, contar eh, con la capacitación personalizada también de las personas que van a estar llevando estos datos. Y el tema que hablábamos también de que hay muchos tipos de financiamiento, de fondos, que algunos no son préstamos, otros son más donaciones o emprendimientos a distintos niveles, ¿verdad? Que a veces son a nivel local, a nivel más pequeño, y pues aquí no es tan fácil catalogarlos o tener una comunicación alineada. Y este tipo de retos nos estamos enfrentando ahora y también queremos estar en la misma base todos. sobre lo que realmente ahora es financiamiento climático actualmente y lo que vamos a tener que estar reportando los próximos años, ¿verdad? Entonces, todo esto se estuvo hablando ayer. El día de hoy vamos a hacer una práctica más, digamos, más numérica y más de caso, en la que también nos va a permitir visualizar todo cómo es el proyecto de mitigación y adaptación y cómo es que se calculan algunos de estos costos, cómo van a ser estas situaciones en la vida real de los proyectos, ¿verdad? Eh, entonces, aquí lo que me gustaría hacer a mí es pasar a mi colega Soren y para que puedan iniciar su presentación.
First of all, thank you very much for having me, for inviting me for this presentation, this workshop today. My name is Søren Lütgen. I'm working with UNEP DTU Partnership. I've been working here for the past 10, 12 years on climate finance. And what I'm going to talk about today is general approaches to determining the cost of implementing nationally determined contributions. To present three different approaches to practically assessing the same thing. And what you have in your agenda for today is the cost-benefit analysis. I'm adding a couple of other issues or elements to that, namely the feasibility and viability distinction in project finance, plus the determination of business cases. Bottom line is that we're looking at the same thing, whether it's from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, a feasibility study, viability study analysis, or a business case. Starting with the cost-benefit analysis. It's a quite common approach. It's a systematic approach to estimating economic strengths and weaknesses of different investment alternatives. It's normally used by the public sector, and most public sectors, it says here in the Western countries, I would actually think that it's in most countries in the world, they require cost-benefit analysis, and they even have national protocols for cost-benefit analysis. So there's a standard for how you do a cost-benefit analysis of a particular proposed investment project. Benefits and costs in CBA, let me call it CBA for ease, are expressed in monetary terms. So we are looking at the cost and the returns.
Se ve el costo y los ingresos de una inversión semi.
They are adjusted for the time value of money. That means that income that you would have in 50 years from now is less worth than income you would have next year. So that adjustment of time value of money is an essential part of the cost-benefit analysis. The CBA is simple at face value. The approach is simple. And I'm sure you all have done, well, at least the principles behind a CBA in your own private households. And if you are buying a car, you would figure out what is the cost of buying a car, what is the benefit of having it, and you would also have realized once you have done that you mostly get it wrong. But at least you know the principle. There are incomes, there are expenses when you buy the car, there are benefits while you are using it, and there are costs from having it. The fundamental thing is that if there are no constraints on input, I mean, if you had all the money in the world, you would adopt all projects that would have a net positive benefit or a net present value more than zero. of course, you have a return on your investment, so why not? If there are budget constraints, which there always is, you cannot buy any car and as many cars as you want. You would choose a combination of projects that maximizes the net benefit, those that have the most benefit for the invested dollar or unit of currency. So that's the simple way of looking at it. It's complicated in practice, and not only from the experience of buying a car and not having all the costs calculated from the outset, but there are more issues involved in this exercise than just these two. But let's do the simple approach first. It's a 4-step process. And step 1, you simply brainstorm all the costs and benefits you would have from investing in a given asset, project, or activity in society, or whatever this investment that you are considering is about. All costs associated with the project, both those that you can imagine, and of course it's difficult to imagine the unimaginable, but you would try to take every thinkable issue into consideration that is relevant for that particular project. You make a list of these, and then you consider the lifetime of the project. Which of those costs and benefits are likely to occur within the lifetime of the project, and when do they stop occurring? Because the question is also what is the cutoff date? When is this not relevant anymore? The activity or the consequences of the activity. Step 2. You assign a monetary value to the costs, and that is the easy part, the cost of physical resources you invest. You know that you're going to buy, I'm not going to use the car again, so it could be you're building a power plant, you have physical resources, you need to know what the costs are of those resources, you need to know what is the cost of the human effort that is involved in all phases of the project. And then you should realize that this is the easy part. When the costs are often relatively easy because they are the ones you start with. You have to build the project before you actually operate it. The more difficult part is the operational costs. What does it actually cost to operate the activity, the project, through its lifetime? And what does it cost after the project's lifetime? Does it cost anything? Does it have a consequence that somebody needs to pay for once it doesn't operate anymore? And just to state one issue, or an example that we all know, nuclear power has been discussed for a number of decades, and one of the main issues here is the waste, which will last, some would say, for thousands of years after the closure, or at least remain dangerous thousands of years after the closure of the project. How do you incorporate a cost for that waste for 1,000 years into a project which might be operational for, say, 50 or 75 years? How to do that? Or would you cut off and say there are costs after the project lifetime? Anyway, that was step 2. The costs are generally easier than step 3, the benefits. And that is because you could also consider the benefits as the income from the project. What is the return on the investment? If you're selling energy, it is the payment for the energy that you are selling out of the project, but it may be other benefits as well. The complication, of course, is that everything is in the future. So you need to establish the value of this string of future payments and compare that to the cost that you have. That is step 4. Benefits are commonly direct and also indirect. The same, in fact, goes for cost. There may be cost saved, time saved, health value of pollution eliminated. There are elements there that may have a value. The question is whether that is a value you would take into consideration or not. So another question here is, again, are there any benefits after the project lifetime? And is there a cut-off date? When do you take future costs or future benefits into consideration? And when do you not? So as you can hear, there's a lot of decisions involved in this assessment. It is not as straightforward as you just take everything imaginable. You would soon come into considering, well, yes, it's imaginable, it's even unimaginable, and I can take it into consideration, but should I? Is it within the boundary of the project? Do I think it is reasonable to take this into consideration? So it is not black and white. It is, in fact, a matter of choice. And therefore, it's not black and white either when you compare the cost and benefits that you have exactly the right answer to your question. Should you do this project or should you not? Are the benefits greater than the costs? Here are just a few examples from a concrete guideline, a national guideline on cost-benefit analysis. And you need to present the base scenario. So you should know what kind of project you need to invest in. That could be a technology choice, but it could also be where you want to put it, the particular project, where in the country you want to put it, or other different parameters. So this is the base scenario. This is the project I want to have if I don't have to ask anyone. Then to define the most relevant alternatives to achieve the same objective. It may be that you want to put it somewhere else, you want to use another technology. As long as it delivers the same service, you consider that as a relevant alternative, and you can have a standard for how many alternatives you must produce in order to have done a standard cost-benefit analysis of a given project. Oftentimes you need to do 3, so 1 base and 2 two alternatives for the base scenario. As I mentioned just before, you can also define limitations to the analysis. What are the things that we do not want to look at? Ideally, you should want to look at everything, as I said before. Everything imaginable, also unimaginable, needs to be taken into consideration. But a guideline can also say, these are the things you do not need to take into consideration. Of course, that some would consider that a flaw then in the cost-benefit analysis because it is not complete. But the guideline can say that it is not supposed to be complete in these particular areas. And then you could also have a standard recommended discount rate. I mean, what is the interest that you're using to discount your future incomes and costs? You can see the small figure here to the right that illustrates what would be the effect of different percentages of the discount rates. If it's, you can see M2, I'm coming back to that figure, but you can see here that the smaller the discount rate is, the more value does future payments have. And of course, the higher the discount rate, the quicker the value diminishes. That is what you can see here also. The complication that you can add to this, so far, I hope at least that you are comfortable with the fact that cost-benefit, at least in principle, is relatively simple. Of course, there are questions that you need to ask yourself, but it's not that complicated yet. The question that I've alluded to a couple of times is there no future beyond the project? I'm using here an example as an open pit coal mine. There's a lot of those well, all over the planet. I'm just thinking of those that we are currently seeing in Eastern Europe here, not so far from here where I'm sitting, 500 kilometers maybe. Big open pits where coal has been dug for decades, maybe even more than 100 years. Re-establishing a pit can be done in several ways. The way that is currently preferred is you just fill it with water. It doesn't cost so much. But how would you consider that cost if you were to start digging an open pit coal mine today? Would you accept that 100 years down the line, the plan is to fill it up with water? Or would you require it to be restored nature? Of course, the cost of that would be very different. So there's somebody here who has to decide what would be the remedy. How do we clean up? Because the cleanup costs are not a predefined unit, or the way you clean up is not predefined. And whether it's part of the project or not, I mean, in the past it was not, today it is. So there's a cutoff here that you may decide to have or not have. Of course, this would be taken into consideration normally in an environmental impact analysis. But again, the question is, what is the cost of tidying up? So cost to whom is another question. There are many stakeholders involved in the project. And if it's a government project, which CBA is normally focusing on, you would normally focus on the cost to the government or to the investor. There are many other stakeholders that may have costs, they may have indirect costs, and so those costs could, for instance, be health-related costs. And you would, in that regard, also consider which benefits, which could easily and equally be health-related benefits from not building a coal-fired power plant. What would be the benefits, and should you value those benefits, and in which way would you value those benefits? So this is adding significantly more complication to the analysis. This is supposed to, here it comes, yeah. And here comes in also the question of the discount rates. Because as I mentioned, the open pit coal mine that may be 100 years old, those costs that you have in 100 years from now, if you have a discount rate of 7, are practically 0. So they don't go into the analysis with any particular value. What you might find instead in practice is that the cost that you are having from those elements that are priced out because of the discount rate is that their cost is in fact increasing. Like what I'm illustrating here with the red line, even though the discount rate says that it doesn't have a value, the actual cost for society might be exponentially growing. So there are flaws here which the CBA simply does not respond to. And the point here, of course, is that the entire climate disaster, the climate change disaster, is due to the failure to correctly determine the cost and benefits of activities. If we had determined those costs from the outset, and the climate change related cost, the adaptation cost, there's a lot of activities that we would never have done. And what we also commonly see is that when economic...
A menudo es que cuando luchan los intereses económicos y ambientales, el interés económico casi siempre sobresale. Es la tragedia de lo común, estas cosas que en realidad todos, de las cuales todos somos dueños. La evaluación de impacto ambiental evalúa algunos de esos costos, pero en realidad no lo evalúa de una manera completa, total.
Of course, it's included. We recently, I think last week, the American government reassessed
La última semana, el gobierno americano reevaluó la creación de una línea de un oleoducto y la detuvo porque no había suficientes consideraciones para tener en cuenta el oso polar. Estas criaturas no tienen una voz, pero sí tienen un valor. Entonces, si miramos el tigre acá, es importante considerar que muchas veces no se toma en cuenta. Las fallas de mercado también deberían ser incluidas, pero son muy difíciles de evaluar y de defender cuando se está llevando al cabo el análisis. Pero como mínimo deberían incluir el costo a la naturaleza, al tigre, a la salud, evaluar cuál es el valor de la salud general de la población y cuál es la causalidad y los efectos de un proyecto y considerar los costos hacia personas específicas, diferentes actores, personas que son directamente afectadas por un proyecto, personas que necesiten trasladarse, desplazarse. Eso también tiene un valor y pensar cuál es el costo de eso. La solución para el cambio climático, como dije, no puede ser más de lo mismo. Siempre hemos usado este análisis de costo-beneficio para hacer todo lo que hemos hecho y aún así nos hemos equivocado.
The CBA must incorporate the real costs to the environment. And one of those costs is the cost of carbon. We tend to calculate the cost as an incremental cost later. But in fact, you could also consider a fixed cost of carbon when you calculate your if they assume it. And one thing, of course, is important in that regard. Even if the value of carbon is not charged to the project, it doesn't mean that it is not a cost. It is just paid by somebody else. So you need to be sure that you include it even when it is not in the investment calculations. The core issue when you do the cost-benefit analysis then is setting the boundaries. And what I've been arguing here in the last 5 minutes is you make sure that you include all the climate change related effects and costs that the project is causing. You make sure that you have a time wise calculation that does not eliminate all environmental costs beyond a certain date, because they are not gone just because they're discounted down to zero. In fact, they are increasing. And here just a curiosity, because I'm sure that you have heard about the marginal abatement cost concept. That is what you end up also having to consider here. What is the cost of this project? What is the cost of reducing emissions through this particular activity? That's why you do a cost-benefit analysis, at least in a climate change context. The marginal abatement benefit concept has never been invented. We have always considered the the action for the climate as a cost. It is not a benefit. And I think that speaks volumes to where we still are in terms of climate change. We are considering it a cost that we somehow need to be willing to pay, not realizing that the cost is already being paid, just not by the ones that are causing the emissions, or the projects that are causing the emissions. I said initially that I would try a couple of other approaches to the same thing, assuming that we're building a power plant. We have feasibility and viability of projects. I'm excluding bankability now because that comes with the business case. If you look at project feasibility, I mentioned here, this is again public sector projects, the infrastructure projects, so energy or transport, water, telecommunication, environment. I mean, that kind of project would normally be subject of a feasibility study. And there are a number of elements that need to consider when you do a feasibility study. These are here, and I think time is running, so maybe I should not go into detail on that. But the idea here is also that you consider all those parameters necessary to determine whether this is technically possible. When you move forward from feasibility to viability, you need to consider also, well, fine, it is technically possible. Is it also financially possible? Can we finance, or can we make an economic, a business case out of this? So what is, again, as the same as in the CBA, what is the cost of the investment? What is the cost of the finance? What are the operational costs? Externality costs are those that are on the environment. You have to price the risks involved in the project. And of course, then you look at the revenues. Are they sufficient to make up for the business case here? In many cases, it's a question of whether it can be made viable. And again, that is also a question of cutting off, maybe. You might have to cut off some costs. Maybe you would think we do not need to include all the externalities, because if we do, this project does not fly. So making projects viable is an exercise in itself, where you look at which costs do you actually include, and how can you improve revenues as well. So making investments viable is very much a political choice. You may decide on a price of energy that includes externalities or not, as I mentioned before. You may not charge the full price of the energy. You may also decide to subsidize agricultural output to make it affordable to low-income households, or to reduce tax on electric vehicles, or to compete against combustion engines. So there's a lot of political choice involved in infrastructure investments in order to determine whether a project is viable or can be made viable or not. And as concluded here, the viability of a project depends on which costs and benefits are internalized into the calculation. I mean, practically being, which cost do you consider and which do you consider outside your project boundary. The public sector is not business case driven. I'm being told that time is flying, so I should go faster here. The public sector is viability driven, is my argument here, but the private sector, if there are private sector investors involved in this, they are actually bankability driven. One thing is that we can make a business case look good, but if you cannot get the bank convinced that it's a good idea, you might not be able to implement the project anyway. And the banks are driven by risk concerns. But maybe I should skip that and this as well. The business cases are when you move from having determined whether your project has more benefits than costs, and you need to have a private sector entity engaged in implementing it, if that is what you prefer to do. And this is the assumption that you do have a private investor, an independent power producer, for instance, that wants to, or you want to, have investing in the project. In that context, you would need to be sure that the business case is solid, and you might, as a public sector entity, have to put in place de-risking instruments in order to implement the activity, which is not necessarily a cost that you have considered when you did your cost-benefit analysis, because that is not looking at the business case of the activity. So that comes on top. Once you have determined that this is, from a societal perspective, this is an activity that we would like to implement, you would have to consider also who is implementing it, and if the private sector is your preferred option, how do you bring the private sector on board? What would be the additional cost in bringing the private sector on board to undertake the investment? Good. And this is not where we have a break. So we continue with the next subject on the identification of incremental costs, or the climate component of investments. It is related, but it's different from the cost-benefit analysis. So, first of all, you need to determine that has been the idea from day one. In fact, that, as I also mentioned before, climate-related investments apparently are supposed to come at a cost, because we have so far not internalized the cost of cleaning up after those investments. So we assume that the climate component has a cost. As there's no activity that has given cost, you cannot have a given incremental cost either. And I'll just give you here 3 different examples on comparing a 300 megawatt gas-fired power plant with a 500 megawatt wind power plant. If you look at the investment cost in the gas-fired power plant, that is 500 million. Wind is 800 million. So you would assume the incremental cost here is 300 million. But maybe it's not. Because, of course, you also have to operate the project over the next 20 years, or maybe even longer, but just assume 20 years. Over 20 years, the gas-fired power plant would have a levelized cost of energy of 35 million. The wind power plant would have a cost of 38. Sorry, it's not a million. This is the unit cost on megawatt hours. So you have 40 million megawatt hours produced. You have a difference in cost of 3. The 3 is between 38 and 35. You have an incremental cost then of 120 million. Not the 300, but 120. It's still more expensive to produce energy with wind than gas, at least in this example it is. Now, third option is that you start charging a carbon cost to the gas power. In this case, it's 10 euro per ton of CO2, or per unit of power that we are using here. So the cost for the gas power now is no longer 35, it's 45, and the cost of wind power is still 38. So now the difference is 7, but in favor of the wind project. So from having an incremental cost of 300 million originally, we now have an incremental profit of 280 million from the wind power project. So in this manner, the incremental cost has actually disappeared. So it really depends on how you calculate your incremental cost, and that is exactly the point that you will be met with when you start discussing this with your potential financiers. The fact is that the budget is not the cost, the investment is not the cost either. There's a lot of other effects that, as I just talked about before on CBA, that would need to be included in a complete or total calculation on what is actually the incremental cost. Again, it's a question of setting the boundaries for your activity. The example here with EU's gigantic COVID recovery program of 1.9 trillion euro. Also here is mentioned is that that's actually not the cost of that program, even though it looks impressive. Most of it will come back to the governments through dynamic effects. There's a lot of labor that is going to be engaged in the recovery program. Labor pays tax come back to the government. So there will be a lot of activities that are, of course, labor also spent money in restaurants. So just to say that the price label is not the same as the actual cost. And also here, the question of when does an activity end? When do the dynamic effects of the 1.9 trillion euro actually end? It's difficult to say, in fact. Probably even impossible to say. So again, there's a question of what is your decision, and what is actually the baseline. And here comes this coal mine, the open pit that I talked about before. Just because the cost of tidying up was not in the budget in the beginning, doesn't mean that it's not a cost now that we actually have to start tidying up. It will never be the coal mine that pays it, at least not at all, unless they're allowed to pour water into the hole. So we are building up environmental debt and somebody has to pay it. So that is also a question of what are you comparing to here when you consider incremental costs. When determining the incremental cost on climate investments, you start, of course, to establish the baseline and the baseline cost, and you do that net, but also in the overall all-inclusive approach. Merete, my colleague, will talk in a few minutes about the adaptation actions that mostly are cost only, at least most of them are cost only. But most activities in mitigation are investments, and they do have a cash flow, and you need to consider that cash flow as well from all aspects, and that influences your net incremental cost calculation. Also consider that if you want to include the private sector in these activities, it actually makes a profit. Otherwise, it wouldn't invest. So how do you consider that profit in your incremental cost consideration? The public sector cannot recover the profit. The profit is what makes things happen here. So is that a cost to the government? Well, it's a cost to the government, but it's a profit to the private sector. So how do you consider that to balance it out or not? And a final thing also, when donors and investors alike are happy to compete against subsidies. So if you're competing with your incremental cost of a particular renewable energy project, for instance, is competing against subsidized coal or oil or gas, when of course the incremental cost is higher because the alternative is much cheaper because of the subsidy. But you need to include that in your calculation as well. Now, what does the Green Climate Fund say? They say that baseline scenarios, which are essential for defining incremental costs, are hypothetical. Defining them constitutes a major issue in the determination of incremental costs and is inevitably a matter for negotiation among the parties concerned. And that is exactly the point here. There is not a fixed number that can be said, this is the baseline and this is the incremental cost. It is all about negotiation, where you define your borderlines, your boundaries of your project, and that definition is an issue for negotiation between the applicant, you, or the Green Climate Fund in this case. And the use of net versus gross incremental costs may lead to different funding levels as well. If net costs are used, any local economic benefit from the project would be subtracted, and therefore the amount of incremental cost would be reduced. That's also what I'm saying. You would have to negotiate this. How much of those dynamic effects that I mentioned, how much of those would you be required to put into your calculation before GCF says, okay, this is a funding level that we can accept. And final point from GCF is that the fact that the alternative project has important economic or local benefits doesn't guarantee that the additional funds required will be available domestically or from external sources. So whatever your calculation or your determination of the incremental cost may be, or the benefits that you might have of a project, it does not necessarily have anything to do with whether you will be able to attract the funding or not. A final piece of GCF guidance is that you need to have a strong theory of change. We're not going to talk about theory of change here. And that you may be required to use quantitative data to the extent at all possible. Oftentimes you will not have data available, but otherwise, to the extent you can support your application, they would insist on access to quantitative data. And here comes in the lead to Merete, because the last piece here saying the funding for full cost adaptation can be justified through incremental reasoning, and funding for full project costs should be though incremental reasoning and funding for all full project costs may be justified under certain circumstances. Merete, you would be then on for the next issue on incremental costs related to adaptation.
Yes, thank you very much, Søren. Because I know some of you are quite interested in the adaptation case and how to capture finance with an adaptation label, you can say. I wanted to just elaborate a little bit from what Søren says and focus and zoom in on adaptation. Again, with some of the Green Climate Fund thinking, they are saying that incremental costs can be understood as additional expenses that produce outputs that results in climate adaptation and mitigation. So it's something that gives a climate benefit compared to the business as usual. So they have a number of examples, and I will give you some links to projects a little later, some examples. You imagine in Panama, you are going to do a large-scale infrastructure investment. It can be a water system, a road or sewage system, or a road construction, harbor, something that you will have to do. And you know that there's a business-as-usual cost. We are simplifying now compared to what Søren says. We believe that there is something called a baseline, a business-as-usual cost of that investment, in the absence of any climate change. If there was no climate change happening, there would be some sort of a cost of this investment if we define what are the boundaries, what is the scope, etc. So these will be a business as usual cost without any climate outcomes, without anyone having done any climate proving, meaning any assessment of what kind of climate elements do we need to put in to make sure it can withstand the climate change. So this harbor should be able to withstand the climate effects we are facing. The road should be able to withstand the climate effects. So the business as usual cost would be without any of these climate change proving, any integration of any climate adaptations or resilience or anything in this infrastructure. Now, if you then add the incremental cost to the business as usual theory case, you would have that covering the climate proving, you would have that covering the climate adaptation or any climate resilient elements of the infrastructure. So for instance, the harbor would have to be constructed in a different way to withstand the sea level rise or withstand any storms or any water challenges if there's a river coming out at the same place as the harbor or similar. And the water sewage system would also have to withstand any changes in the water table, any changes in the sea level rise or similar that would influence salinity in the water system or similar. So that would be then included in the project, and the incremental cost is in theory, the price tag of those adaptation elements, you can say. I want to show, next slide, please, an example of this. So this is an example from a publication from us. You can see the source at the very bottom. So it's trying to work both with this theory thinking about what is business as usual, but also with the concept of additional cost or incremental cost. So just to give a little bit more flavor to this idea. So first of all, we have a starting situation. We have a development issue that needs to be addressed. And that should be addressed even if there was no climate change. So in this case, it could be poor access to water or frequent water shortages. And that in turn lead to a number of issues around health, around food security, increased workloads, etc. Now, you want to do something about this development scenario, this challenge you're facing, and you are then establishing what would be a business as usual development scenario. What would we do to address this issue in the absence of any climate change? So we would dig some more wells, we would construct some dams, we might establish some water management committees so you agree on who can take water when and where. And all of those things would be part of a business as usual scenario. It would never, this scenario could not be eligible for any climate finance. We couldn't go to the Green Climate Fund and get some money to cover this business as usual scenario, because they are all elements of a project that would happen even in the absence of climate change. But then if you add the aspect of the climate change vulnerabilities in this scenario, and you are saying we need to do some further work that has to do with climate change. So for instance, construct the wells in a different manner so that they are reflecting the reduced rainfall, and constructing the dams in terms of the scope and size so that they meet the demand that are related to climate change. So prolonged dry periods, for instance, and that you establish frameworks and committees that are also able and perhaps have data that relates to the climate change effects on the water availability. So you are adding a number of elements that are adaptation activities and that are constituting the incremental cost or additional cost to what we knew in the business as usual scenario. So in that case, as you look at the number 4, that will be the adaptation action, and that will be the responses that you are doing because of climate change. And those additional costs, those actions that has a price tag, that would be what, for instance, the Green Climate Fund would consider incremental cost, and that they would be willing to finance. And I want to show in the next slide, yes, a few examples here, because as I said, climate funds are willing to pay some of these incremental costs that are delivering specific climate outcomes. I'm giving here a few examples, and I will talk about them without showing them in a great extent. It's actually some of the very first examples of GCF finance. So the first one is a project number 8. You can find it in this link. It is taking place in Fiji. It's about the water and sewage system and the renovation of that. And it was an Asian Development Bank project in Fiji. Fiji is what is called a small island development state. And small island development states has a lot of challenges due to climate change because they are very vulnerable and their water systems are vulnerable as well. Salinity is coming into the water systems, the water tables are changing, and there's a real damage being done due to climate change. So this project, you had to do anyway a renovation of the water sewage system because it had to be updated due to age and due to development of population in Fiji, etc. But you also had to renovate it due to climate change. And that resilience part, that price tag was what the Green Climate was picking up. The Asian Development Fund, Asian Development Bank was funding the general part, and the Green Climate Fund was funding the resilience part of this renovation of the water and sewage system in Fiji. The other example is, by coincidence, I could find other examples, is also a small island development state. It is the island and country of Nauru. And in that case, I think it was in fact also the Asian Development Bank, by coincidence, they were proposing to construct a new harbor because in Nauru, they have had a real problem of getting access to the goods that are delivered by ship because the harbor couldn't withstand the climate effects. So the big ships couldn't really land in the harbor. So the harbor had to be upgraded anyway, but it also had to be upgraded due to the climate change effect, due to the fact that in the case of storms and big waves, etc., these big ships couldn't go into Nauru, and there had to be boats coming from Nauru out and undocking some of the goods and then sailing back to Nauru and unboarding that and then back to the ship, etc. So quite complicated ways of getting goods to Nauru. So in that sense, the harbor construction was partly to upgrade it, nevertheless, because it was old, and partly to address the climate change effects. And again, the incremental cost of this project was financed by GCF, and the rest was financed by the Asian Development Bank and the government of Nauru. So those are two examples you can study if you're looking for trying to use your vulnerability assessment and your adaptation work in overall infrastructure investments in Panama, and try to put a price tag on the adaptation part of all of those investments. Now, already Søren talked about full cost, net cost, etc. I would say that on adaptation, it's possible to get a full cost project, for instance, with the Green Climate Fund, where you can get it financed fully. But there has to be absolutely no return on that investment. So it has to be an investment where there is no revenue coming out of it, no return, no benefit to anyone that can be monetized. And that can be difficult to demonstrate. So in many cases, it's easier to go for incremental cost approach and try to really estimate that part where there is no revenue, there is no one benefiting from this investment. Now, the net cost is, of course, where you are deducting the economic benefit from these outcomes. They are subtracted and therefore you arrive at something that is more reduced, which is the net cost. Now, also Søren was very clearly underlining the general idea of having to quantify this, which can be tricky, but not impossible. Now, in the case of Green Climate Fund, there is a real need to have solid data on the climate effect in relation to a project. So if we go back to the Fiji situation, there is in that case, a real discussion back in the early days of the establishment of the Green Climate Fund of what part of that water sewage system renovation and what part of the problem in the current system was caused by climate change. So there was a need for the Asian Development Bank and the government of Fiji to really try to estimate what is really caused by climate change and what is just the general wear and tear, the general you can say damage that has done over the years. So you have to have solid data on the climate effect. It can involve a vulnerability assessment or similar. And I know you are interested in that topic in Panama. So that would be a typical thing to be done, to try to uncover the data and cover why is this system vulnerable? Why will this road be vulnerable? Why would this harbor be vulnerable? Or whatever investment you will be looking at. The other thing is that, of course, you have to have a robust quantification of the cost of what are you then doing about this problem. So first, the cost of the current effects on the system or whatever it is, and then a robust identification of what are the actual activities you need to do. As I showed before, in the water system, it would be a new scope of the dam, a completely different well because of climate change, a committee that needs to know a little bit more about climate change, etc. So you have to have a very good idea about what are that resilience effort, what are those activities, those investments from a technical point of view, and then you need to be able to establish the cost and also what would be the absolute and relative of that overall cost of the project. And also maybe estimating the benefits and then deduct that so you arrive at some net cost, net incremental cost before you go to the Green Climate Fund, for instance, to get this covered by the Climate Fund. This was my last slide on this, so it's nicely wrapped up here, and I think we are following the time schedule. So with that, I will wrap up. Back to Jorge. Okay.
Thank you, Merete. Gracias. Ahora vamos a pasar una pausa de 10 minutos. Todos, por favor. Y vamos a volver aquí a las 27. Voy a poner aquí la agenda actualizada, un segundo. Entonces tomamos esta pausa y nos vemos en 10 minutos aquí mismo. Hola a todos. Aquí entonces voy a pasar a la siguiente presentación con mis colegas de nuevo con Søren para pasar a esta próxima parte de instrumentos financieros.
The financial instruments for projects that you have now undertaken a cost-benefit analysis of. You would also need to figure out how do we get it implemented. Right. So, assuming that we are now past the point, we have done our cost-benefit analysis, we have decided that the costs are less than the benefits, we would like to implement the project. We need financing, and we have just discussed also with the approach here to the Green Climate Fund that we would consider there's an option maybe to achieve funding from a source like the Green Climate Fund. At least we would like to think that. But before you go to a financing institution, you need to figure out exactly what kind of financing do you need, how do you structure your project. The last thing you do is, in fact, to go to the financing institution. Before you go there, there's a lot of steps that you need to take in order to present your case in the best possible way to, for instance, the Green Climate Fund. So here are a few principles. I'm going to come back to them in more details. Just here is a quick overview. Before you start choosing your financing instruments, you start by avoiding the finance you do not need at all, which of course is logical, but most don't think of that. There is no given cost of an activity. You may shop expensively or cheaply or smartly. You may also think that what looks expensive to begin with is actually more cheaper than what is cheap in the beginning, which turns out to become expensive later. Or smartly here could be referring to you may actually be able to make other entities pay for your activity or at least part of it before you start financing it. Minimizing the cost is in everybody's interest, but minimizing here is not necessarily just buy as cheap as possible. In any case, you will probably have to pay most of the cost of any activity that you're looking for, except, of course, for adaptation, where Merete just told you that it is possible to get full cost finance. But particularly for mitigation, most of the financing would have to come from your own sources. And you would probably have to take a loan and not achieve a grant. And loans will have to be repaid, even if they have a grant component, where the interest may be lower. You still have to repay the loan. So it is in your interest to make sure that you do not finance something yet you really do not need to finance. So, in order to get to that point, you need to structure the activity. That means to decide which activities are in and which are out, who is in and who are out, who are supplied and who are not supplied. So you structure the activity in the most efficient way that you can think of. Then you reduce the cost elements as much as possible. So you only finance what you actually need to finance. You alleviate the risks, as I mentioned before. Very, very briefly, if you want a private sector engagement, you have to make sure that the risks are quantified, they are eliminated to the extent possible, or alleviated or covered by other entities, so that the risks are manageable and also possible to put a price on. You monetize the positive externalities if you can, and maybe you cannot, but that means that it may be possible to extract financing from parts of the economy where benefits are felt. That could be health benefits, and make that help financing your activity. That is a difficult exercise and is not commonly successful. You may distribute, or you should distribute, the costs on relevant stakeholders, and you should, of course, select financial instruments carefully, because the choice of instruments are also a significant part of the cost. Not all financial instruments come at with different price tags, and we need to consider that. Then two important things to think about, because we always talk about cost efficiency and cost-efficient emissions reduction. Cost inefficiency is not a disqualification in itself, and it has never been. In fact, we have been able to finance renewable energy investments over the past 30 years. It's only now they start to be out-competing fossil alternatives. Until now, for the past 30 years, we have been able to finance renewable energy regardless, even if it has been cost inefficient. So, and the illustration here is, in fact, also that it would be easier to finance solar PV than it is to finance energy efficiency, even if the energy efficiency is highly profitable and small-scale solar PV may not be. This is an old drawing, so in fact, it's difficult to find solar PV investments now that are not profitable. Anyway, finally, financial engineering or engineering the finance of activity is not necessarily influenced by the cost of abatement. That's exactly what I'm saying. You can structure the finance. It's not a question of the cost. It's more a question of the risk, in fact, whether you can finance a project or not. So principles here, again, a little bit more in detail. And I'm not talking financial sources here, mind you. I'm talking about the instruments, the financial structures that you're looking at. Because, as I said initially, you only go to the financing sources at the end of this exercise. So you structure the activity that concerns the scale, it concerns the components, and it particularly concerns the ownership. Who is going to own whatever facility that you are going to build? Will it be publicly owned? Is it a government intervention? Is it a private intervention? And in that regard, could it be a private intervention with third-party financiers that have a different role? I come to that in the next point here. I also mentioned before, you reduce the cost elements as much as possible. There are things you absolutely need to have. There's things that are nice to have that you might not need, at least not in the short term. So you focus on those things that you absolutely must have. I also mentioned you can shop expensively or cheaply, but it does not necessarily mean that you buy cheap goods up front, because they have an operating life and operating cost, which need to be considered as well. So buying expensively up front could be the cheaper option in the longer run. Then you may also reduce cost elements simply by making sure that somebody else is paying for it. And by that, I mean here third-party engagement, for instance, through performance contracting. We have, particularly in energy efficiency, the concept of energy performance contracting. But in fact, that also goes for renewable energy. You have performance contracting where companies are paid only based on the services they deliver. That means they bring the financing and you do not. So if they, the suppliers, bring the financing, you do not need to bring the financing yourself. So to some extent, you will be able to outsource the financing obligation to a third party. Now, alleviate the risk, as I mentioned before, that is a central issue for the private sector. You really must be focusing on eliminating those risks that in many cases can be a showstopper, or if not a showstopper, then at least can be a source of a particular cost. Risks can be very costly to sometimes they are just showstoppers. So if the risk cannot be covered, forget about implementing. If the risk can be covered, it may also be a very expensive risk to cover if it's not covered by the right entity. And in that regard, you would always try to allocate the risk to those parties most suited to bear them. And one thing here is important: no government, normally at least, governments do not consider themselves as being the source of the main risk, even if governments commonly are the source of the main risk. So here is something that needs to be looked at as well. Governments need to be able to look objectively at their own role in the project and make sure that the risks that they pose themselves are in fact not risks. Such risks could, for instance, be payment risks. Monetizing the positive externalities, that's what I mentioned. Those are probably the most difficult thing to do, and oftentimes is not done. whatever project you may be doing may actually reduce costs in other sectors of the economy, and it may then be possible to make budget changes where you have those positive effects in other sectors benefiting your financing situation for the project that you want to implement. But this is an entirely internal government finance issue that I'm indicating here. Then distribute the costs on relevant stakeholders. For instance, introduce levies on externalities. You would make sure that costs incurred by alternatives, for instance, depending again which kind of project you are implementing, but you may consider levies on fuel, for instance, other fuels, levies on coal in order to finance a renewable energy project. So here it depends on how you consider the boundaries of your project, again depending on what the project is. But there is a cost or a value on the externalities that a project causes that may be taken into consideration when you want to finance your project. And then you select your financial instruments carefully. I will come back to that in more detail because, as I said before, some instruments are actually costlier than others. So the sources of financing, I'm not talking about here, well, whether it's a Green Climate Fund or the Asian Development Bank or the Latin American Development Bank or CAF or who it may be relevant to address in this regard. I'm talking about what is the financial products that we are looking for. And here first is where does the public sector go to find financing, or what kind of financing does the public sector go and look for? What I mentioned here first is environmental fiscal reform, and that was what I meant when I said externalities could be taxed, for instance, as a source of financing for activities. Environmental fiscal reform fundamentally means that you would shift your taxation system towards taxing the cost to the environment or the externalities. So costs, environmental costs are simply charged from the perspective or the philosophy that if the polluter doesn't pay, the government eventually will have to pay. That is again the question of the open coal mine, the pit here. Well, there was no obligation when we gave the coal mine the approval to dig, so we cannot go to the coal mine and ask them to clean up after themselves. It is now a cost for the government. So in order to avoid that, you would have to put a tax on those things to make sure that it is not the government that has to lift the bill afterwards. It is actually the polluter that pays. So you could also call this an instrument that supports the polluter pays principle. You put a tax on those things that has an environmental cost. So that is a national tax reorganization. It doesn't have to be a reorganization. It could just be an additional tax. You don't need to move tax from other taxed subjects to the environment. You can add the environmental tax on top. Again, it is not a cost that is a new cost. It's just a question of who actually pays for the cost. The government can also go out and take loans in the bank on normal conditions, and that is what most countries actually do when they finance their activities. But many countries also have access to soft loans. Soft loans are loans where the interest is subsidized. That would be what you can get in the Green Climate Fund. You can get it in development banks. So soft loans is a common concept. The question here is the softness of the loan. To what extent can you? What is the interest rate that you can actually manage to get? How low can you go on the interest rate on the soft loan? Bonds, and those are increasingly green bonds for financing of climate change activities, but there are standards that needs to comply with if you want to have a green bond. And green bonds are in fact not more attractive in terms of interest than normal bonds. But bond is an instrument that is a common government instrument, issuing bonds as a loan instrument. Governments may also be able to access dedicated credit lines in development banks, where if they are focusing on particular investments, types of investments that are prioritized by development banks, there are credit lines that can be accessed. It is again, it's fundamentally a type of loan, so it's not different from in principle, it's not different from a normal loan. And finally, you have you have risk covers and guarantees. You will be able to access guarantees also from the Green Climate Fund if a guarantee is a product that you find fits your project financing needs the best. And finally, of course, you can get grants. But one of the slides I skipped before the break was even though grants are not sought for. They, in fact, only make up 3% of the total funding for climate change activities. 3% of the total financing. So they are very difficult to access. They play a minor role in climate finance. So it is not the preferred choice, and not the suggested preferred choice, definitely. But it's there, and of course, good work if you can get it. But it's not what should be the basis for your financing models. So that is where the government would source its financing from, or the types of instruments that allows the government to finance its part of an implementation of a project. Then the government would also deploy that financing. Now I have, say, $100 million of loans for a project, but I need to deploy that into the structure, the project, the activity that I want to implement. Of course, I could also go and, as a government, say, well, I would like to provide a grant-based model. That is very often done. I would say commonly ill-advised. You put a grant program for supporting energy efficient, air conditioners, for instance. You may think you need to do that in order to take up those energy efficient air conditioners, even though the payback time on such air conditioners might be 2 or 3 years. So they are already very profitable, but in order to improve the uptake, you might think a grant is the way to go. So it is an instrument. It is not always applied wisely, but it is used, and it does have its useful applications. What you might want to do instead is to make a specific qualification. I should have mentioned here maybe minimum environmental performance standards. So you do contracts, specific contracting of goods and services on specific conditions. You may also provide additional payments, like feed-in tariffs. You add a fee on top of what is already paid for a power supplier. That has been the fundamental, the foundation for renewable energy for the past 25, 30 years. A feed-in tariff that made sure that the projects were profitable. So that kind of additional payments can be a way to deploy the finance that the government has sourced on the left side of the figure here. Public procurement guidelines, green procurement is commonly a way to go here. And green procurement then could be that has an extra cost, and that cost could be covered by the sourced financing on the left. It may also be possible to promote investments with tax credits, or tax reductions or tax exemptions. Very often you have tax or exemption of import duties for environmental goods. So that's another instrument that also come at a cost, because of course it's a lost income to the government. Same thing with depreciation. You may allow immediate depreciation of certain technologies as a part of a financing structure. You can also remove subsidies of competing products like subsidies on fossil fuels. If you remove those, you immediately make the economy of the alternatives, emission-free alternatives, better, because you have raised now the alternative price from fossil fuels. But of course, removing subsidies is not, in fact, a cost. It is an income. If you remove your subsidies, you in fact are creating additional revenue to the government. So I should have put that in the left side of the figure here. Then you can also channel the loans that you may have taken to fund your activities. You can channel that through loan schemes for particular purposes, or guarantee schemes also for particular purposes of investment. So these are instruments that a public sector operational operator can deploy as instruments in a financing structure. If there's a particular project that needs to be established, you want, for instance, a private sector investor, you would, as a public sector, consider which are the instruments that I, as a public sector, could go in with to help financing in the financing structure for this particular investment. I'm wondering if I should describe these instruments also, because there are also a description here of different. If you are a private sector investor, you would consider these particular sources of investments. I'm just wondering, I need the same here. They are in fact those that are coming after this slide here. On the right side of this figure, you also have the private sector financing instruments. So what you are doing in the middle of this figure as a public sector entity that promotes a private sector investor is that you combine your instruments with the instruments that the private sector is typically using in order to establish its investment. So consider here the relationship, for instance, to be an independent power producer. On the right here in the figure, what can you do as a public sector entity to finance or to make sure that the independent power producer on the right here in the figure can make its financing model come together when the private sector financier is using the instruments on the right side. So that could be a question of whether can you support the equity, can you support the first loss debt instruments, how can you support the loans? Can you provide a loan scheme with a subsidized interest rate, for instance? Can you buy the bonds from the private sector? Can you provide access to bonds financing for the private sector? Can you provide risk cover for the investors, for those financiers that will have to engage with a private investor? Or can you even provide a grant for a particular activity? So this is just to illustrate that there are different instruments in the private sector which you as a public sector entity may want to engage in, also engage in the structuring of when you want to engage a private sector investor. And I think with that I can actually skip the next two slides here. Right. I mentioned that it is not unimportant what kind of instrument that you deploy for financing of they come at different costs, and you get more for your unit of currency with some instruments than with others. And this illustration here is in fact originally made in order to promote the usage of guarantees, and guarantees provided by the public sector as the instrument that comes at with the most leverage of all instruments from the public sector. If you can provide the guarantees or the risk cover, if you will, you may be able to achieve that the private sector can in fact finance the entire investment by itself. But that is what this illustration here is to show that if you start in the middle, you may provide the asset when the investment. You may do that by yourself as a government. That would be the most expensive way to deploy your finance, is you establish the assets yourself. And then moving from the center of the figure out to either the left or the right, the more you move away from actually investing in the asset and supporting the cash flow or the finance with support instruments, the less capital you need to deploy in order to make sure that the investment can succeed. The relationship between the guarantee and the cash flow here is you may support the cash flow with a feed-in tariff, for instance, if you now go to the right in the figure. But if you can guarantee the cash flow, you don't need to support it with a feed-in tariff, but you guarantee the payment over a certain number of years, then that is an even cheaper way of deploying your finance. So that is the idea of this video. Just to illustrate, it is really important which financing instrument it is to go out to a financier and ask, for instance, for GCF, and say, I want to buy a power plant, or I want to establish a guarantee scheme for the cash flows for a private investor in a given power plant. It's two different project proposals. You need to decide which one you're going for. What I'm trying to show here is not to confuse everything. I know it looks terrible, but in fact it does have meaning. And the assumption here is that you do actually not want the government to invest its own means in a particular project. You are inviting in an independent power producer to produce energy or another public service, but at least it is a private entity that establishes a special purpose vehicle for the investment in a particular activity or project. This is to illustrate who does what, which cash flows goes from whom, who are involved. And as you can see here, the SPV is the center of the whole thing. That is where the banks are lending money. That is where the private investors are injecting their equity. That is the hybrids that I mentioned here. I didn't show that on the other slide. The hybrids here are development finance institutions. I call them hybrids because they provide both equity and loans, and have also soft loans available if necessary. And you have also donors that, to some extent at least, can participate with grant financing. As I mentioned before, there isn't much grant financing available out there, at least not for that kind of cash flow generating activities. So you can see on the arrows that some are injecting capital into the SPV. Most of them here do. Some are also injecting capital into the government. And you can see here the lower one, the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund would inject the money either into the project, but alternatively also into the host government. The host government will be adopting, assuming the loan responsibility to pay back the loan. Then the host government can provide a tax holiday, for instance, as you can see here, to the right, to the private investor. But it can also provide a feed-in tariff to the SPV. It can provide a tax exemption, or all the other instruments that I in fact mentioned before. So you should consider this figure as a representation of the list of instruments that have been deployed here and how the cash flows are flowing from the different stakeholders in the financing structure. And I will leave you with this figure here also, because in the breakout groups, we're going to go to do group work in a few minutes. I will in fact ask at least one of the groups to look at this figure and consider which types of financing, which types of cash flows would be relevant for a given investment. I'm going to show you which I suggest that you use. Just for you to discuss what are the instruments here available, you can take the examples that I'm proposing, or you can also look at projects that you already know in Panama that could be subject to an analysis like this one. I think that is it for now. I don't even know what time it is. The time is up also, so we are in fact at the end of the session. A few takeaways from all three sessions, and I will run through those quickly. First of all, there are textbook principles, but there are no textbook approaches. That means that you will actually choose your approach to determining the cost based on your purpose and based on your role in project development. You may want to emphasize the costs. You may want to emphasize the benefits, depending on who is your counterpart when you discuss your project and the project financing. You may maximize the instrumental costs or minimize them. That also depends on your counterpart. You may wish to emphasize your domestic climate finance, or you may wish to underscore the shortage of investment capital, or you may wish to do both. Again, depending on what is your purpose, who are you, who is your counterpart, what is your chances of achieving financing, depending on how you present your project. If the purpose is to access financing, as both Merete and I talked about, be prepared for negotiating the basis for the financing before you negotiate the actual financing. You need to be in agreement on what is it, what is the basis, what is your project about. Is it net or is it gross? What is within, what is outside the boundaries of the project? You need to be in agreement on that before you start negotiating the actual financing. And as I mentioned just now, the cost-benefit analysis is entirely dependent on setting of the boundaries, both project-wise and particularly time-wise, and particularly on setting the discount rate, where I'm suggesting that you do actually not allow your projects to disregard cost in the future just because the discount rate makes it free. The incremental cost and calculation are entirely dependent on the baseline. And the choice of financial instruments, that was the last point here. The choice of financial instruments are, in fact, very much depending or determining what is the actual cost of your activity. And finally, and importantly, be transparent about what you do, how you calculate, and what you include. Because your counterpart, when you go to financing, will ask in any case. That is the conclusion on those three sessions. We have now the breakout work, group work, but I will hand back the microphone to Jorge. Thank you.
Thank you, Søren. Muchas gracias. Entonces, vamos a tomar una pausa de 5 minutos en la cual vamos a dividir los grupos como el día de ayer. Entonces, vamos a hacer esta pequeña pausa y en 5 minutos ya estamos aquí con sus grupos divididos, ¿de acuerdo? Hola a todos. Voy a iniciar la discusión ya para terminar porque se nos va el tiempo de las 3 preguntas que estuvimos discutiendo en el grupo. Entonces, para ser breve y que mis colegas de los otros 2 grupos también puedan avanzar, voy a empezar con la pregunta 1 sobre cómo utilizar el enfoque de vulnerabilidad para descubrir y entregar datos sobre la parte climática y bueno, de los problemas que las inversiones pretenden abordar, ¿no? Y se hablaba que es muy importante utilizar instrumentos como la plataforma de transparencia que está en desarrollo, identificar en qué se invierte actualmente, o sea, realmente tener una identificación de todos esos proyectos actuales de mitigación y adaptación en una base de datos para poder saber cómo comenzar y determinar pues, cuál es el enfoque deseado. Un tema importante que mencionaba en el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas es fomentar el uso de las etiquetas de financiamiento y gasto, o sea, lograr que las etiquetas de inversión estén creadas, definidas y también se enfoquen en adaptación, ¿verdad? En temas de los ministerios. Entonces, para que los gastos puedan estar en este nivel. También hay temas de temas legales y en algunos proyectos contraposiciones, porque algunas leyes pues todavía no incluyen el tema, la parte climática, y están todavía pues apoyando otras inversiones, ¿verdad? Entonces todavía no se ha actualizado y esto es un tema, un reto. Y bueno, el tema de las obras públicas que buscan más costos eficientes, como hablábamos, que queremos ahorrar costos y bueno, asegurar de que los conocimientos y capacidades estén para estos proyectos, porque en los proyectos a nivel local, como se decía, las capacidades todavía no están para abordar estos temas de adaptación. Voy a pasar a la pregunta 2. Para institucionalizar el proceso y pues identificar los esfuerzos de adaptación, resiliencia, claro que sin institucionalizar pues no sería posible, ¿verdad? Pero lo que se habló fue que simplemente hay que iniciar con sensibilizar a los diferentes niveles de grupos de interés para tener un mecanismo alineado. O sea, adaptación, resiliencia, que se entienda cómo se va a abordar, qué costos van a formar parte de esos proyectos y cómo se puede hacer mejores estudios de factibilidad, de costos, de costo-beneficio, como nos exponía Søren, porque los proyectos, muchos todavía no están usando el valor de estos costos para hacerse, ¿verdad? Y como parte del marco legal, las normas para que las instituciones puedan integrar también adaptación, el sector privado, el mismo sector privado que pueda saber qué le están pidiendo de adaptación y resiliencia, porque pues ellos están haciendo proyectos, ¿no? que necesitan generar retornos, pero si no hay una norma clara sobre cuál es la directiva a seguir, pues no es fácil, ¿verdad? Entonces todo esto es necesario para la adaptación y la resiliencia. Voy a pasar a la pregunta 3 y hablamos de cómo cubrir los costos incrementales de adaptación. Aquí estoy incluyendo, también lo he hablado sobre los instrumentos por parte de Soren, porque pues queremos saber, tenemos los costos incrementales de lo que hablaba Merete, que la adaptación va a significar, a partir de ser un business as usual, el costo incremental que el GCF o algún fondo me va a ayudar a cubrir para la parte climática de adaptación. Esto, bueno, es muy importante cubrirlo. Dicen algunos colegas que actualmente Panamá asume los costos incrementales. Hasta el momento no tiene problema para asumirlos, pero se habla también de que en el futuro va a haber más y más necesidades, ¿verdad?, de adaptación. Existen instrumentos como seguros contra desastres naturales actualmente, y se estaba hablando de instrumentos como los bonos verdes de deuda para poder acceder a cubrir estos costos de adaptación, donaciones del Fondo Verde del Clima y de otras instituciones para poder cubrir estos costos iniciales. Muchas veces estos estudios iniciales, que después de ser la donación se va a convertir en un financiamiento de préstamo, simplemente un capital para la vida del proyecto. Por otra parte, el factor del periodo de la vida del proyecto para cubrir estos costos es muy importante, porque depende de cuántos años es un proyecto de adaptación, si es de infraestructura o si es de ecosistemas, bosques, va a ser diferente, y el tipo de instrumentos también va a ser diferente, porque si el proyecto está evolucionando, también los instrumentos van a hacerlo. Vamos a pasar a los siguientes compañeros. Quiero escuchar las demás discusiones para el tiempo, no irse más.
Primero que todo, gracias al equipo, al grupo de trabajo. Y bueno, pudimos sacar algunas conclusiones respecto a la primera pregunta sobre cómo puede Panamá utilizar su enfoque de vulnerabilidad, resiliencia y adaptación para descubrir, entregar datos sobre la parte climática de los problemas de la inversiones pretenden abordar. Primero, se menciona que los niveles actuales de resiliencia que contamos en el país es aún muy deficiente y que no estamos adaptados a los efectos del cambio climático, ya que no existen proyectos que logren impactar estos lugares donde se ven más afectados, ya que hace falta una mayor experiencia para lograr resultados de estas inversiones más allá de productos técnicos. También se mencionó que las debilidades están en que no se implementan políticas de Estado que contribuyan al abordaje de estas necesidades. De igual forma, la data actual sobre bosques, por mencionar algunos, la de bosques, manglares, están desactualizados. Mencionaban que muchos de estos son de hace 10 años atrás o más, y que esta información suele ser desactualizada y solamente aproximaciones, lo que esto pueda dificultar un poco sobre el manejo de esta información. También se proponía que se podrían medir a través de indicadores qué tan desarrollados están los programas de vulnerabilidad, resiliencia y adaptación. Ejemplo, en el caso de adaptación, buscar organizaciones que proporcionen financiamiento para la adaptación con la construcción de diques fluviales o costeros en las zonas necesarias. También una de las observaciones que se hicieron estaba el que es necesario un plan de mejoras al analizar indicadores provenientes de estos proyectos que permitan identificar dónde deben realizarse las mejoras, ¿no? O sea, el tema de las lecciones aprendidas de estos proyectos, y para poder asegurar la continuidad de los mismos. También existe desconocimiento sobre temas de cambio climático y cómo estos se ven reflejados en los proyectos, esto a nivel institucionales y de los diferentes sectores. En la segunda pregunta, se menciona que para lograr la institucionalización es necesario el acompañamiento por decretos que faciliten el cumplimiento y esfuerzos de adaptación de resiliencia. Es necesario definir quiénes son los actores, cuáles serían sus roles o responsabilidades. También se menciona que es necesario un trabajo colaborativo entre instituciones, por mencionar algunos, entre el medio ambiente, para contar con toda la información y respaldar las inversiones, proyectos en los sectores prioritarios. Debe existir un plan de capacitación que permita a los actores relevantes ser capaces de institucionalizar e internalicen dentro de las instituciones. Es necesario que todos los actores se sienten de forma previa a dialogar sobre este procedimiento y el seguimiento de intercambio de información de forma continua. Al igual que luego de contar con el marco legal definido y establecidos los roles de cada instancia responsable, se requiere un responsable que coordine y capture la información a través de un sistema que tenga la información accesible a los tomadores de decisiones y técnicos, y que es importante que el país priorice todos los esfuerzos a nivel local e internacional, toda vez que se requieran recursos presupuestarios para implementar acciones en materia de adaptación y resiliencia del cambio climático. Y por último, bueno, ahí se nos fue cortando el tiempo, pero se destaca que se debe involucrar al sector privado para lo que es el abordaje de los costos incrementales de adaptación, también buscar otros tipos de mecanismos y fuentes de financiamiento. Esto por parte del grupo.
Bueno, me avisan si pueden ver la pantalla.
Sí, se ve.
Ante todo, muchas gracias a los participantes de la sesión número 2 por sus valiosos comentarios. Para la pregunta número 1 tenemos cómo puede Panamá utilizar su enfoque de vulnerabilidad, resiliencia, adaptación para descubrir o entregar datos sobre la parte climática de los problemas que las inversiones pretenden abordar. Tenemos que Panamá en marzo de 2020 inició su participación en un convenio regional con diferentes ONG en proyectos de financiamiento climático. Bueno, este proyecto está orientado a incorporar la reducción de riesgo de desastres y la adaptación, tanto la adaptación como la mitigación en la inversión pública. Dentro de estos talleres se trabajaron 4 sectores, en los sectores de educación, salud, agua, saneamiento y agricultura. Actualmente se cuenta con un diagnóstico inicial que se presentará a finales de este año, y dentro de estos talleres se logró la participación del SINAPROC, el Ministerio de Ambiente, tanto el sector público como el privado y personal del sistema institucional de Panamá. Actualmente se encuentra con un grupo de trabajo que trabaja en análisis de riesgos situacionales, y se pretende establecer convenios con la NATI, el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas y el Instituto Nacional de los Datos Espaciales, que busca establecer un módulo para los formuladores de proyectos para futuros análisis. También tenemos que actualmente Panamá cuenta con el decreto ejecutivo número 100 del 20 de octubre de 2020, que establece la plataforma de transparencia climática. Esta plataforma permitirá albergar los programas a nivel nacional en los diferentes componentes del cambio climático, en adaptación, mitigación y temas de financiamiento climático. También Panamá ha iniciado, en la medida de sus posibilidades, la implementación de proyectos enfocados a conocer la vulnerabilidad de sectores claves del país, como lo es el sector de recursos hídricos, agricultura y la salud, al tiempo en que se considera las cuencas como unidad de exposición y el ordenamiento territorial como una clave estrategia de adaptación al cambio climático. Por otro lado, existen diversas iniciativas enfocadas a la promoción de las energías renovables y la eficiencia energética, con el objetivo de que la población tenga un conocimiento de cómo contribuir a reducir las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Y por último, tenemos que fortalecer la gestión público-ambiental y contar con una política nacional de cambio climático. La República de Panamá ha venido realizando una serie de adecuaciones a la gestión ambiental para hacer frente a los nuevos retos ambientales y en ese sentido ha desarrollado la política de cambio climático que en conjunto con la política de biodiversidad y la política de gestión de recursos hídricos busca fortalecer al país en materia de adaptación y mitigación del cambio climático. De igual forma, el gobierno de Panamá ha iniciado una valoración de las implicaciones que trae inmerso el cambio climático y las medidas de respuesta al cambio climático en la seguridad financiera del país, con especial énfasis en las medidas de mitigación y sus efectos. La siguiente pregunta en que estuvimos trabajando es ¿cómo puede Panamá institucionalizar un proceso para identificar los esfuerzos de adaptación, resiliencia y sus costos como parte de las inversiones o proyectos a gran escala en una amplia gama de sectores? Actualmente Panamá cuenta con una plataforma informática basada en la gestión por resultados. Esta plataforma se bancó de proyectos. Por el momento solo se tiene el módulo de formulación del proyecto, pero se implementará un módulo de seguimiento y la evaluación a término del mismo. También se espera incluir en el módulo de formulación un etiquetador para todos los proyectos de todos los sectores. También se cuenta con la plataforma Nacional de Transparencia Climática. La idea de esta plataforma es que sea un medio de divulgación de datos relacionados con el cambio climático por transparencia y que también se pueda ser utilizable para algo. Y aquí se puede vincular con el tema de los informes de vulnerabilidad y los inversores pueden ver estos datos y planificarse para tomarlos en cuenta para sus futuros proyectos, sea en el sector público o privado. Y la última pregunta que estuvimos trabajando fue ¿cómo cubrirá Panamá los costos incrementales de adaptación? A través de estudios en materia de vulnerabilidad al cambio climático y se plasmen cuáles son los retos a afrontar en los sectores específicos como el sector de construcción y agropecuaria. Y de esta manera, a través de proyectos que se puedan realizar con fondos públicos del Estado, poder sustentar ante organizaciones internacionales como Green Fund los costos adicionales de un escenario que incluya el cambio climático y poder tener para aplicar a estos fondos.
Gracias a todos. Quería pasar a mis colegas. Si Merete, Søren, alguien más tiene algún comentario, aquí estamos para la discusión final.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and we highly appreciate all of this work you have done in the group work, and also your patience while we were doing the talking. Much appreciated, and we do hope it's useful. We note that you all have been working at the same questions that are related to adaptation and incremental cost, but in fact we had some other material made for other groups, and we suggest that we share that with you afterwards. They were some case studies that Søren had presented, which was focusing more on cost-benefit analysis and some other aspects. You want to present it now, Søren, or should we just share it with the groups afterwards?
I think we just send it. I also agreed now with Håkon in the chat that we will just send the slides, which is in fact just inspiration for discussion on how you would apply the instruments that I've been talking about for two projects that have recently been established in Panama. The natural gas-fired power plant. I can't even read what the name is because it's not here, but it was established here just 2 months back, plus a solar power plant which was established last year. So just to have two cases, local Panama cases, that you could use as a basis for discussing cost-benefit analysis and financial structuring. But I will send that to Håkon, and Håkon will make sure that you all get it, I'm sure.
And as for the group work that was done now and presented here, I think for me it's again showing that you already have in place a number of good initiatives and good avenues to pursue the integration of adaptation and also the integration of the cost of adaptation compared to a business as usual scenario. You have a number of avenues to do it already, and you have in addition a number of suggestions to go about it and how to institutionalize it in terms of legal or at least some formalized ways of going about this. And I think that's very commendable, and it sounds like you are well underway or have the opportunity to get well underway in terms of integrating adaptation and vulnerability in the investments of Panama, and making sure that these kind of efforts and efforts of resilience are taken into account and financed as well. So I was very pleased to hear that, and thank you very much for sharing this with us. On my side, thank you for your participation today and for your patience.
And I can only echo that. Thank you very much for taking time to listen to us. Sincerely hope that it was worth your while.
Gracias a todos y vamos a concluir la sesión. Entonces, muchas gracias por participar. Las grabaciones y las presentaciones van a estar en nuestra página web en los próximos días. Cualquier cosa, vamos a estar en contacto.